At our son's opulent housewarming party, my wife gripped my arm so tightly her fingers nearly dug into my jacket. Amidst the clinking of champagne glasses, she leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave, right now." I looked at her completely bewildered. "Why, what's going on?" She stayed silent, casting an uneasy glance down the hallway. It wasn't until we were safely locked inside our car that she finally spoke. She turned to me, her face ghostly pale. "You never actually saw the final closing documents for the house, did you?" What she told me next left me completely frozen. "My name is Richard Caldwell. I turned 70 today. For the past 40 years, I poured my life and soul into growing Caldwell Logistics from a single, beat-up delivery truck into a massive national enterprise. My wife, Catherine, and I worked tirelessly, all just to provide our only son, David, with the life we could only dream of when we were young. We paid for his college, we threw him and Monica an extravagant wedding, and just last month, I wired over $1.2 million in cash. That was the down payment on a $2.5 million estate in an upscale Illinois suburb. That was supposed to be their forever home, a safe place to raise our future grandchildren. That was our dream, at least that's what I thought. Tonight was the grand housewarming party. The winding concrete driveway was packed with expensive luxury cars, and catering staff navigated the crowd with high-end appetizers. But the moment Catherine and I stepped through the front door, I felt an intense sense of unease. David and Monica barely performed the duties of hosts. Instead, Monica's mother, Beatrice, was acting like the lady of the manor in the grand foyer. Beatrice is the kind of woman who has achieved nothing of note yet carries herself as if she owns the world. She strutted around the living room, barking orders at the staff, and pointing out custom renovation details, as if she had personally paid for every single brick. I tried to ignore it. I told myself she was just an overbearing mother enjoying her daughter's success. I grabbed a sparkling water and stood near the kitchen, watching my son. David looked nervous. He kept adjusting his tie, avoiding my gaze every time I looked his way. And whenever I tried to approach him to ask how the move was going, Monica would conveniently appear to pull him away to greet other guests. The atmosphere was suffocating. In a house bought with my own money, I felt like a total stranger. That was when Catherine grabbed my arm. Her face was drained of all color. My wife is a strong, composed woman who remained steady through the high-pressure years of building our business. Seeing her so terrified sent a chill straight down my spine. I followed her outside, leaving the noise of the party behind. The cool night air hit us, but it did nothing to calm my racing heart. We nearly jogged down the long driveway to where I'd parked. I unlocked the car, we both scrambled in, and Catherine immediately locked the doors. She was breathing heavily, clutching her purse to her chest. I kept my hands on the steering wheel looking at her. "Catherine, tell me the truth. What is it? Did Beatrice say something to you?" I asked, frustration rising in my chest. She shook her head slowly, struggling to steady her breathing. "Richard, it's the house. You told me you wired the money into David's escrow account. You told me this house was for our son." "It is for our son," I replied, my stomach beginning to knot. "I handled the transfer myself. The real estate attorney sent over the preliminary agreements last month, and all the documents had David and Monica's names on them. Is there a problem?" Catherine closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. I wanted to use the restroom. The downstairs one was occupied, so I went upstairs. As I walked past the primary suite, I saw the door to the private study wide open. Beatrice was inside. She paused, swallowing hard. Richard, she wasn't just in there. She was standing by the desk with a glass of wine, showing off something on the wall to 3 of her friends. They were laughing at us. I felt my blood pressure skyrocket. "Laughing at what, Catherine? What did you see?" She turned to face me, her voice trembling with a mix of deep sorrow and pure fury. It was the property deed. It was framed, hanging right behind the mahogany desk. I pretended to admire the woodwork and stepped closer to look. Richard, I saw the name on that official document. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. David and Monica, I stated firmly, though a sickening suspicion was already spreading through my chest. No, Catherine whispered. David's name wasn't on that deed at all. Monica's wasn't there either. The property is registered entirely under a limited liability company. A limited liability company. I repeated the term in my mind, searching through corporate legal jargon. Which LLC? Kensington Holdings, Catherine replied. The air in the car suddenly became incredibly heavy, suffocating. Kensington. That was Beatrice's maiden name, the one she frequently used to boast about her fictional noble lineage. I stared out the black windshield, my brain desperately trying to process the severity of what my wife was telling me. Are you absolutely certain? I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. I am very certain, Catherine said, wiping her face. I saw the state seal. I saw the registration date. It was filed 3 weeks ago, right after you wired the money. Richard, you didn't buy a house for our son. You bought a $2.5 million mansion for Beatrice. She owns it all. I sat in the dark in dead silence. 40 years of hard work. 40 years of missed family dinners sacrificed to build a company, all to ensure my son had a secure future. And he had taken my life savings and handed the keys over to his manipulative mother-in-law. My own flesh and blood had orchestrated a massive deception right under my nose. The disrespect was paralyzing. The betrayal was absolute. A cold, calculated anger replaced the shock. I am not an emotional man. I am a problem solver. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I dialed David's private number. I listened to it ring once, twice, 3 times. In my mind, I pictured my son standing in that lavish living room, glass in hand, playing the part of the successful homeowner while his mother-in-law held the real power. The call finally connected. David, I said firmly, my voice echoing in the quiet car. We need to talk right now. But what came through the phone was my son's voice. A sharp, sickeningly arrogant laugh erupted from the tiny speaker. Oh, Richard, Beatrice's voice dripped with deep satisfaction. David is far too busy helping me move my antique furniture into the master bedroom. Thank you so much for such a lovely little gift. The line went dead. I stared at the black screen of my phone. The silence in the car was broken only by my wife's quiet sobbing beside me. Beatrice had just confirmed every fear that had taken root in my chest. I shifted into gear and drove us straight home. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I sat in my home office, the walls that had witnessed me drafting the original business plan for Caldwell Logistics 40 years ago. I opened my laptop and logged into the county property portal. Within 10 minutes, I found everything Catherine had described. The deed to the $2.5 million home was officially registered to an LLC called Kensington Holdings. I pulled up the company registration. The sole managing member of Kensington Holdings was Beatrice. My son and daughter-in-law held zero equity in the house I had provided the $1.2 million down payment for. I printed every page. The printer hummed, spitting out the cold, hard evidence of my son's betrayal. I placed the documents into a manila folder and waited for sunrise. At 6:45 in the morning, I pulled into the executive parking lot of Caldwell Logistics. Usually when I arrived at this massive glass and steel building, I felt a swell of immense pride. But today, I felt only a bone-chilling cold. I nodded at the security desk and walked past my own executive suite, heading straight for the financial wing. David was the chief financial officer. 3 years ago, I had handed him that title, Believing he had the integrity to manage the business empire, I intended to leave to him. I never imagined I would face him this way. I didn't knock. I pushed open the heavy oak door to his office. David was sitting behind his massive desk, drinking coffee, eyes locked on his dual monitors. He looked up, startled by my sudden appearance. "Dad," he said quickly, masking his surprise with a practiced, casual smile. "What are you doing here so early? I thought you and Mom would be resting after the party. We didn't see you during the toast." I didn't return his smile. I stopped directly in front of his desk. I looked at this man, my son, trying to find a shadow of the honest boy I had raised. Instead, I only saw a slick executive wearing a custom suit bought with my money, sitting in an office I had built, weaving a web of lies. I opened the manila folder. Without a word, I took the printed county property records and slammed them onto the center of his desk. David recoiled. His eyes fell on the documents. I watched the color drain from his face in an instant. His confident posture crumbled. As he scanned the name highlighted in neon marker on the company registry, a bead of sweat broke out near his hairline. "Kensington Holdings. Would you mind explaining to me why my $1.2 million down payment bought your mother-in-law a mansion?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Dad, listen to me. It's not what you think." He finally stammered, his voice losing its usual steady authority. "You don't have the full picture. There are some things you don't understand about how we structured this." "I understand perfectly," I replied, leaning forward over his desk. "I understand that I gave you money to secure a future for your family, and you secretly handed the deed over to Beatrice. She even took your phone last night to mock me. So, you have exactly 1 minute to tell me the truth, or I am calling the bank to report a case of major financial fraud." David wiped his forehead. He was panicking. Before he could cobble together a decent lie, the office door opened. Monica walked in carrying a tray of expensive pastries and 2 designer coffees. "Richard," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "we didn't expect you to be here today." "Apparently not," I replied, my eyes still fixed on David. Monica walked to her husband's side, her eyes scanning the property documents spread across the mahogany desk. I saw her body go rigid, a defensive wall immediately going up. She looked at David, then turned her gaze toward me, her expression hardening. The sweet daughter-in-law mask evaporated. "Did you really go and dig through public records just to spy on us?" Monica asked, her tone suddenly full of indignation. She put her hands on her hips, standing in front of David like a shield. "I cannot believe you would violate our privacy like this, Richard." "Violate your privacy," I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "I handed over more than $1 million of my hard-earned money to you, Monica. I have every right to know whose name is on the property deed." "It was a gift," she immediately countered. "A gift means you let go. It means you trust your son to make the right decisions for his family. Instead, you were sneaking around behind our backs, treating us like criminals. This is controlling, Richard. Honestly, it's sick." David quickly took the cue from her. With reinforcements, he found his courage. "Monica is right, Dad," David said, shaking his head slowly. "We're adults. You can't just storm into my office and shout accusations at us because you don't understand modern financial planning. You're reacting emotionally, not thinking logically." I felt a sickening churning in my stomach. In this manipulation, they were completely in sync. They stood side by side looking at me, with no remorse in their eyes, only shared annoyance. "Emotional?" I asked calmly. "You call secretly transferring a $2.5 million asset to Beatrice logical?" David let out a long, heavy sigh. He leaned down and pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk. "I didn't want to bother you with the complexities of our wealth management strategies, Dad. You were supposed to be stepping back and enjoying your retirement. But since you insist on making the worst possible assumptions about your own son, I'll show you. David pulled out a thick black folder with a gold-embossed logo of an accounting firm on the cover. He threw it on the desk. He placed his hands flat on the smooth leather cover, meeting my gaze with a frightening, calculated confidence. He wasn't sweating anymore. He was fully prepared to weave an incredibly complex lie right to my face. "Sit down, Dad," David said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite him. "Let me explain exactly how the tax system works. This folder has the answers to your reckless assumptions," he added, his voice dripping with condescension. "Once I'm finished, I expect a sincere apology for this unprovoked intrusion." I looked at the folder, then back up at my son. 40 years of work, and it had all led to this moment. He actually thought I was a naive old man who would blindly accept his next lie. David opened the folder with slow, deliberate movements, smoothing the papers down with his palm. He cleared his throat and adjusted his posture, perfectly projecting the image of the confident executive I had spent years training him to be. "Dad, the world of real estate and large-scale fund transfers isn't as simple as it was 40 years ago when you bought your first house. We're dealing with massive sums, and the federal government is always looking for ways to aggressively penalize the transfer of generational wealth. If you had just wired the money directly into our personal accounts, we would have faced absolutely staggering gift tax liabilities. It would have destroyed us financially before we even moved the first piece of furniture into the living room." He pointed with manicured fingers at a spreadsheet filled with dense projections of tax brackets and depreciation schedules. "Monica's mother has a brilliant accountant who manages portfolios for some of the wealthiest families in the state. He advised us that the safest, most financially responsible way to handle your generous contribution was to flow it through a temporary holding vehicle. Kensington Holdings is just a shell company, Dad. It's a protective barrier. Beatrice is just acting as a temporary trustee to protect the asset. According to the strategic timeline detailed in these documents, the LLC will be fully dissolved in exactly 90 days. On the 91st day, the property deed will automatically transfer entirely into Monica and my name. We were trying to protect your investment, not steal it. We just wanted to handle the stressful logistics ourselves so you could focus on enjoying your retirement." It was a masterclass in performance. The financial jargon was used flawlessly. The surface-level logic seemed completely airtight, designed to sound responsible and highly professional. If I were an average, uneducated person, I might have felt an immediate sense of relief. I might have praised my son for his exceptional foresight. But I had spent my entire adult life studying corporate tax law to build Caldwell logistics. I knew instantly that every word out of his mouth was a carefully crafted lie. "You absolutely cannot use your mother-in-law's private LLC to circumvent federal gift taxes on a primary residence. It is legally absurd." It was a fairy tale wrapped in corporate terminology. I kept my face completely expressionless. I didn't interrupt him. When he finished, I let the silence hang in the air. The silence made Monica extremely anxious. She realized David's spreadsheet presentation wasn't enough to extinguish the suspicion burning in my eyes. She stepped forward, abandoning the defensive posture for a more manipulative strategy. Her lower lip began to quiver, and her eyes filled with well-timed, crystalline tears. "Richard, how could you think such terrible things about us?" she asked, her voice choked with a fake, forced sadness. "How could you believe we would do something so malicious? My mother has been working herself to exhaustion this past month, meeting with lawyers and accountants just to make sure David's and my interests were protected. She took on the legal liability of the holding company alone, just to help us keep our dream home. She is making a massive sacrifice for our family, and instead of thanking her, you're treating her like some kind of sinister criminal." She placed a trembling hand on David's shoulder. "We've worked so hard to build a life, just to make you and Catherine proud. We wanted to surprise you when the ownership officially transferred in 90 days. We wanted to show you that we're responsible adults who know how to protect our family assets. But you wouldn't even give us the benefit of the doubt. You only assume the worst. Richard, your distrust is so hurtful. It feels like no matter what David does, no matter how hard he tries to be the son you want him to be, you always find a way to make him feel like a failure. You're trying to use your money to control our marriage, and it's tearing this family apart. David stood up from the leather chair, circled the desk, and wrapped his arms around his weeping wife in a protective embrace. He looked at me with an expression of profound disappointment. "Please, Dad," he pleaded, his voice softening into a tone of a child begging for parental empathy. "Don't ruin the harmony of this family over a simple misunderstanding about a temporary tax structure. Mom was so upset last night. Monica is falling apart now. We just want to move forward and enjoy this beautiful home that you helped us acquire. Just wait 90 days. You'll see the deed transfer. You'll see that everything I told you is the absolute truth. Just trust me." I stood in the center of the office, surrounded by the business empire I had built from the ground up. I looked at the son I had raised and the daughter-in-law I had welcomed into my home. They were looking at me with expectant, tear-filled eyes, waiting for my submission. My instincts were screaming that this was merely the surface of a much darker, far more dangerous conspiracy. The lie about tax loopholes was too well rehearsed. Monica's tears were too perfectly timed. Beatrice's arrogant laughter on the phone the night before simply didn't match the image of the selfless, devoted mother they were painting. I realized in that moment that confronting them head-on with logic and anger would be futile. They were ready for a battle, but they weren't ready for a surrender. If I wanted to uncover the real truth, I needed them to believe they had successfully fooled me. I needed them to let their guard down. I needed to be the ignorant, tired old man in their eyes. I deliberately let my shoulders slump forward, shrinking my stature. I raised a hand to pinch the bridge of my nose and let out a long, shaky sigh that sounded like I was admitting defeat. I forced my expression to transition from icy fury to genuine exhaustion. "I'm sorry," I said, intentionally letting my voice sound weak. "I'm just old, David. The world changes too fast now, and these modern financial structures are just too complicated for me. When your mother saw Beatrice's name on the deed last night, we were both terrified. We panicked. I didn't mean to maliciously accuse you of anything. I just wanted to know that you and Monica were safe and secure. I wanted to know that my hard work truly helped you. I apologize for overreacting and storming in here. You're right, I should have trusted you." The atmosphere in the room underwent a physical shift. The defensive tension drained completely from David's shoulders. Monica sniffled, wiped her eyes, and gave me a weak, forgiving smile. They exchanged a very quick, subtle look of absolute victory. They had won. The old man had backed down. "It's all right, Dad," David said, his voice returning to its normal, confident tone. "I know you only had our best interests at heart. We accept your apology. Let's put this behind us and focus on the future." "Thank you, son," I replied softly. "I won't take up any more of your time then. We can talk about the house again later." I turned and walked with slow, measured steps toward the office's heavy glass doors. I deliberately mimicked the heavy, dragging gait of a defeated man. I reached out and grabbed the brushed steel door handle. As I pulled the heavy door open, the bright fluorescent lights of the hallway shone onto the thick glass panel, turning it into a perfect black mirror. The angle of the reflection perfectly captured the area directly behind the mahogany desk. David thought I wasn't looking anymore. He thought I was broken. In the reflection on the glass, I saw him practically dive back into his leather chair. He grabbed the mouse and began clicking frantically. I watched the screen's reflection on the door. He was violently dragging a specific digital folder directly into the system's recycle bin. The text on the screen was large enough to be clearly legible in the reflection. It was a folder he was absolutely desperate to hide from me. The name of the deleted file was burned deep into my memory: Caldwell pension transfers. The drive home was a calculated, dead silence. The image of my son frantically deleting a file named Caldwell pension transfers played on a loop in my mind. Creating a tax loophole for a mansion was one thing. That was just a simple deception born of typical greed. But deliberately tapping into the employee pension fund crossed an incredibly serious moral line, to the point of being almost unbelievable. I had hundreds of hardworking employees who had entrusted their retirement to me. If David was diverting their money, he wasn't just stealing from me. He was destroying the lives of people who had spent their entire careers building my company. I had to know exactly who was pulling the strings behind the scenes. David was arrogant, but he was cautious at his core. He didn't have the guts to plan a financial crime of this magnitude alone. Someone was pushing him. I needed to see the dynamics inside that house when they thought no one was watching. I stopped at a boutique in the city and bought an incredibly luxurious crystal vase. It was the perfect apology gift, an olive branch extended by a defeated father. Just past 2 in the afternoon, I arrived at the estate. The wrought iron gates were wide open. A landscaping crew was busy trimming the vast front lawn. I parked my car near the fountain and walked up the stone steps, clutching the crystal vase tightly. I didn't ring the doorbell. The heavy oak front door was slightly ajar. I stepped into the foyer quietly, letting the shadows mask my arrival. The house echoed with the bossy voice of Monica's mother. I walked silently down the marble hallway, following Beatrice's sharp tone into the main living room. The sight I witnessed made my blood run cold. It was a masterclass in psychological domination. David, the CFO of a $40 million empire, was humiliated, crawling on the floor on his hands and knees. He was holding a tape measure, measuring the edge of a giant Persian rug. Beatrice was standing directly over him, holding a porcelain teacup. The look of pure disgust in her eyes as she watched him was palpable. "Move it exactly 2 inches to the left, David," she barked, her tone dripping with venom. "I've told you a dozen times I want it perfectly centered with the chandelier. Are you completely incapable of understanding a simple instruction?" David fumbled clumsily over the thick fabric, his hands visibly shaking. "I'm sorry, Beatrice," he mumbled, his voice so faint it was barely audible, not daring to look up at her. "I'll fix it right now." Beatrice let out a loud scoff, a sound filled with deep contempt. She snapped her fingers at him twice, a sound that was sharp and utterly insulting. "Fix it quickly. The interior designer will be here in 20 minutes, and I will not allow my home to look cluttered because of your incompetence." I watched my son shrink into a ball, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The confident executive who had tried to intimidate me hours earlier was gone. In what should have been his own home, he was a terrified, compliant servant, bowing to the whims of a tyrant. I took a heavy step forward, letting the sole of my shoe make a loud, sharp click on the marble floor. David jumped instantly, brushing the dust off his slacks, his face flushing deep red with intense embarrassment. Beatrice turned around, and her eyes narrowed suspiciously when she saw the crystal vase in my hands. Monica walked in from the adjoining kitchen and stopped dead when she saw me. "Richard," Monica said, her voice tight and defensive, "what are you doing here without calling first?" I forced a warm, apologetic smile onto my face. "I came to drop this off," I said, holding up the sparkling vase. "I wanted to formally apologize for my behavior this morning. I overstepped, and I want to respect your boundaries in the future. I just want us to have peace between us." Beatrice looked at the vase, her lips slowly curling into a smug, triumphant smile. "That shows maturity, Richard. Just put it on the side table and don't scratch the wood." I set the vase down gently and turned my attention to David. He was staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact. I needed to see how deep this control went. "David," I said casually, keeping my tone light and conversational. "Since I'm here, I wanted to ask you about the Q4 financial forecast for the Regional Distribution Center. Is our new warehouse in Ohio still on track to open in November?" It was a basic question any executive should be able to answer in their sleep. David opened his mouth to speak, but Monica stepped directly in front of him. She stood like a guard dog, physically blocking my line of sight. "David isn't working today, Richard," Monica said sharply, her tone commanding. "All of our energy today is going into decorating my mother's new home. Your little logistics company matters can wait until Monday morning. He isn't going to answer your high-stress work questions right now." I looked over her shoulder, trying to catch David's eye. He just nodded, staring blankly at the freshly painted wall. "Monica is right, Dad," he whispered, sounding utterly defeated. "I'm busy with the house. We can talk about logistics next week." The psychological horror of this situation hit me. My son no longer had any control over his own life, his own money, or even his own voice. He had been conquered. They had stripped him of his autonomy and turned him into a compliant tool to advance their financial interests. "Of course," I said, maintaining the facade of exhaustion. "I completely understand. I'll just use the restroom and let you get back to your busy day." I walked through the living room, heading straight down the hall toward the guest bathroom. I knew exactly which room Beatrice had claimed as her private study. It was the same room where Catherine had seen the framed property deed. The heavy wooden door was wide open. I slipped quietly into the room. The space was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and leather. I walked quickly toward her massive mahogany desk, my eyes scanning for any loose documents. As I rounded the heavy leather chair, the toe of my shoe kicked the edge of an ornate metal wastebasket. It tipped over instantly, spilling a pile of crumpled paper onto the polished hardwood floor. I crouched down, trying to clean up the mess before anyone heard the noise. As I reached for a crumpled ball of paper, a brightly colored logo caught my attention. I carefully flattened the torn paper out on my knee. They were 3 final demand notices from different offshore casinos in the Caribbean. The letters were addressed directly to Beatrice Kensington. Bold red ink at the bottom demanded an immediate wire transfer to settle outstanding gambling debts. I stared at the shocking string of numbers printed on the paper. Beatrice wasn't some wealthy aristocrat avoiding government tax audits at all. She was a degenerate gambler, drowning in tens of millions of dollars in offshore debt. And she was using my son and my company's pension fund to pay for her own miserable survival. I placed the torn final casino demand notices back into the ornate metal wastebasket, arranging them exactly as I had found them. Even though a hurricane of rage and epiphany was raging in my mind, my hands were surprisingly steady. Beatrice was drowning in offshore gambling debt, and my son was her financial lifeline. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my blazer, and took a deep, steady breath. I walked out of the private study and down the long, luxurious hallway back to the main living area. Monica and David were still standing in the exact spot where I had left them, their postures still radiating defensive tension and smug superiority. I gave them both a polite, tired smile, playing the role of the defeated, clueless father perfectly. I told them I was glad we cleared up the misunderstanding, wished them a pleasant afternoon decorating their new home, and then quietly left through the front door. The drive back home felt like walking through thick, suffocating fog. Now, the pieces of the puzzle were terrifyingly clear. David wasn't just a naive husband trying to appease a demanding mother-in-law with tax loopholes. He was an active, willing participant in a massive financial crime. When I got home, Catherine was waiting in the kitchen, her eyes wide with anxious anticipation. I poured myself a small glass of water and sat down across from her at the kitchen island. Lowering my voice, I told her everything. I told her how Beatrice was treating our son with such degrading insults. About the computer folder I had seen him delete regarding the company pension fund, and the torn casino demand letters hidden in the wastebasket. Catherine covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling in her eyes as the sheer scale of this betrayal hit her. Our son is stealing our money to fund her gambling addiction. We have to call the police, Richard, Catherine whispered, her voice trembling with fear and deep sorrow. We have to stop him before he ruins everything we've built. I shook my head slowly, taking her shaking hand across the marble countertop. No, I replied softly but firmly. If we confront him now or alert the authorities prematurely, David will immediately wipe out the remaining digital evidence. He is the CFO. He controls the servers. He controls the daily ledgers. He will claim that I am a confused old man making wild accusations, and Monica will fully back him up. We cannot win a war of words against two people who have spent months perfecting their lies. If we want to stop this, I need incontrovertible, hard evidence. I need the raw financial data downloaded directly from the company servers, and I have to get it without David knowing. I spent the rest of the night acting completely normal. I had dinner with Catherine, watched the evening news, and went to bed at our usual time. I needed to ensure that if David was monitoring my behavior in any way, all he would see was a tired, retired executive living a quiet life in his twilight years. But sleep was absolutely impossible. I lay in the dark, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock, waiting for the dead of night to arrive. When the clock struck 2 in the morning, I slipped quietly out of bed, leaving a sleeping Catherine behind. I walked down the hall to my home office and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, the blue light from the screen illuminating the dark room. It was time to investigate the company I had spent 40 years building from nothing. David was a highly educated financial executive, but he suffered from that blind arrogance common to young men. 3 years ago, when I handed him the keys to the financial kingdom, he immediately changed all the primary administrator passwords, skillfully locking me out of the daily operational metrics. He wanted total control, and he believed his suite of modern cybersecurity protocols was impenetrable. But David forgot one crucial detail about Caldwell logistics. I wasn't just the founder. I was the person who had personally supervised the installation of the original network architecture 20 years ago. Before the company had a dedicated IT department, I had written the code for the legacy admin backdoor access portal myself. I opened a command terminal on my laptop and began typing in strings of old, hidden credentials that hadn't been activated in over 15 years. I watched the screen load, holding my breath and praying that those old security patches were still buried deep within the server framework. The screen flickered with a flash of green. I was in. I bypassed all the superficial, highly sanitized quarterly reports that David usually showed the board during official meetings. I needed to see the raw, unprocessed data. I navigated directly into the CFO's master ledger, the central nervous system of our entire corporate operation. I began pulling up vendor payment logs from the past 12 months, scanning through rows of thousands of transactions. I was looking for anomalies, unauthorized bonuses, or ghost contractors. For the first hour, everything looked infuriatingly normal. Legitimate invoices for fuel, vehicle maintenance, warehouse leases, and employee salaries scrolled across the screen. David had hidden his tracks exceptionally well, burying his theft under mountains of daily company expenses. My eyes burned from staring at the bright screen, but I refused to stop scrolling. Then I finally saw it. It was a monthly recurring payment authorized directly by the CFO. Exactly $30,000, categorized under the vague heading of Strategic Logistics Consulting. The vendor receiving these massive transfers was simply listed as Bidge Consulting. I clicked on the vendor profile, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pulled up the registration and billing address associated with the account. It was a rent-controlled apartment complex in Chicago's South Side. It was the exact place where Beatrice had lived before Monica married my son. Bidge. Beatrice. The sheer audacity, the absolute arrogance made my blood boil. David was siphoning $30,000 every month from my company's earnings and wiring it directly to his mother-in-law to feed her gambling addiction. He was draining the company's accounts to pay off the offshore casino creditors. The self-righteous gall required to execute this conspiracy was simply staggering. I reached out, ready to initiate a massive record download. My fingers hovered over the trackpad, ready to capture the hard evidence I needed to save my life's work. I clicked the master extract icon, expecting a progress bar to appear. But before the download even began processing, the entire computer screen froze completely and then flashed a blinding, violent red light. A high-priority system security warning popped up directly in the center of the dark monitor. The text was terrifyingly large and absolutely clear. Admin override detected. Immediately alert the CFO. The trap had been triggered without warning. David now knew exactly that an unauthorized user was currently active inside his secure network. He knew someone was hunting him. I stared at the glaring red warning on the monitor, not hesitating. I pressed the power button and held it until the screen went completely black and the fan noise died. Silence returned, but my brain was racing. David would receive that automated alert immediately. Given the severity of the financial crimes he was committing, panic would completely consume him. He wouldn't wait until business hours to investigate a high-level breach like this. He would come straight to the source of the override code. I had to be absolutely prepared for his arrival. I closed the laptop, pulled a stack of old, physical retirement portfolio folders from my drawer, and scattered them across the desk in a messy heap. I needed to make the room look like the cluttered workspace of an aging man struggling to understand his own finances. I walked upstairs and slipped back into bed beside Catherine, watching the clock on the nightstand slowly tick toward dawn. I didn't close my eyes. I just waited for the inevitable arrival of my desperate son. At 6:15 a.m., the harsh screech of tires gripping the driveway broke the quiet of early morning. A car door slammed shut with immense force. Seconds later, a flurry of urgent, heavy pounding smashed against our front door. Catherine woke up beside me. I gently placed a hand on her shoulder, telling her to stay in bed and promising that I would handle whoever was downstairs. I put on my heavy bathrobe, intentionally leaving the belt slightly crooked. I ruffled my gray hair, ensuring I looked disheveled, as if I had just been woken up. I walked slowly down the wooden stairs, letting my footsteps sound heavy and tired. The pounding continued, near frantic. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. David stood on the front porch, bathed in the pale light of early dawn. He looked utterly broken. He was wearing the same dress pants from yesterday, paired with a wrinkled t-shirt. His eyes were bloodshot, scanning the foyer frantically as if expecting to see federal agents waiting to slap him in handcuffs. "David," I said, letting my voice be thick with drowsiness and a slight confusion typical of a father. "What are you doing here so early? Is someone hurt?" He didn't wait for an invitation, pushing past me into the house. He stood in the center of the foyer, gasping for air, desperately trying to steady himself. He ran a shaking hand through his messy hair. "Dad, we had a major emergency at the company," he said, his voice tight. "Someone breached the main financial server last night. Someone triggered a master admin override at 2 in the morning. My security protocols flagged a catastrophic unauthorized login from a legacy access portal. I drove straight over because the physical IP address traced back to this residential network. Did someone break into your home office? I watched him perform his desperate routine. He was trying to mask his pure terror as the concerned, diligent executive. He needed to know if it was me pulling the strings, or if some anonymous hacker was downloading records of his illegal transactions. I let my shoulders slump. I raised a trembling hand to touch my forehead, rubbing my temples as if enduring a brutal morning headache. I let out an extremely awkward, heavy sigh. "Oh, David," I muttered, avoiding his eyes. "I am so sorry. I had no idea this would cause such a terrible commotion. There's no hacker, son. It was me." David froze completely. The last remaining color drained from his face as he braced himself for the worst-case scenario. "You?" he asked, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "What do you mean it was you? What were you doing in the master ledger at 2 in the morning?" I shook my head, playing the role of an extremely frustrated, tech-illiterate senior perfectly. "I couldn't sleep," I explained, my voice trembling with a well-manufactured shame. "I went downstairs wanting to check my personal retirement portfolio. You know, I like to review quarterly earnings, but that new financial software you installed last month is impossible to operate. I couldn't figure out how to access my private shareholder dashboard. I kept clicking different menus, and then those warning boxes just kept popping up on the screen." I pointed weakly down the hall toward my office. I tried using my old master password from when we ran the legacy system, hoping to bypass the new security wall. I must have triggered the alarm. The screen suddenly flashed red, and the computer froze completely. I was so frustrated by those glowing warnings that I just pulled the plug out of the wall and went back to bed. "I am so sorry for waking you up, David. I just wanted to see my pension statement and ended up breaking the whole system. I feel like a total fool." I looked up at him, my eyes wide and apologetic. I waited for his reaction. I watched a deep, intoxicating sense of relief wash over his entire body. The terror in his bloodshot eyes vanished instantly, replaced immediately by that familiar, sickening arrogance. He let out an exaggeratedly loud sigh, looking up at the ceiling as if asking the universe for patience with a foolish child. The transition from a terrified criminal back to a condescending superior was seamless. "Incredible," David scoffed, his tone dripping with condescending irritation. "You unplugged the machine, Dad. You can't just go inputting obsolete admin codes into a modernized enterprise network. You triggered a level 5 security cascade alert. I thought we were under a coordinated cyber attack from a foreign entity. I nearly had a heart attack just so you could look at a simple retirement statement." He shook his head, placing a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder, a gesture clearly meant to assert dominance. "Listen," he said, in the slow, drawn-out cadence one uses with a toddler, "you're too old to be messing around with this advanced technology. Systems are completely different now. They're incredibly sensitive. You need to leave technical operations to me and my team. If you want to view your personal pension files from now on, call my assistant. We'll print a hard copy for you. Never attempt to log into the servers yourself again. You'll only cause unnecessary damage." I nodded submissively, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. "You're absolutely right, son," I mumbled. "I'll leave the heavy lifting to you. I'm sorry." David patted my shoulder. "Go get some rest, Dad. Let the younger generation handle the details." He turned and walked out the front door. I watched him through the side window. The moment his luxury car disappeared around the corner, my posture straightened. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. I grabbed my backup burner phone and dialed a secure number. "Thomas," I said, my voice cold, stripped of all paternal benevolence. I need you to quietly tear my son's life apart." Thomas Bradley wasn't a man who asked questions. He was a forensic auditor who operated in the shadows. He was a ghost who could trace every cent of stolen money through a labyrinth of international shell companies and encrypted offshore accounts. As I hung up the burner phone, I felt the first real moment of peace I'd had in days. The trap was set. Now I just had to play my part. The opportunity arose that Friday. Catherine invited David, Monica, and Beatrice over for a family dinner. It was a long-standing tradition, but tonight felt like the stage being set for psychological warfare. Catherine spent the entire afternoon preparing her signature roast, completely unaware that Thomas was currently digitally dismantling our son. I hadn't told her what I'd found in the master ledger in the middle of the night, nor that I'd called Thomas. I needed her reaction to be completely authentic. If David suspected for even a second that we were plotting against him, he would panic and destroy the servers. They arrived at 7 o'clock sharp. David walked through the front door with a bottle of expensive wine, wearing a relaxed, confident smile. The panic from the early morning system alert had completely vanished from his face. He believed he had successfully neutralized the threat. He believed his father was just a tech-illiterate, aging man who had accidentally stumbled into the wrong computer files. Monica followed, holding a bouquet of flowers, playing the part of the dutiful daughter-in-law to perfection. Then Beatrice. She swept into our home as if she were a monarch inspecting a rustic village. She wore a custom silk gown and diamond jewelry, all of which I now knew had been purchased with the stolen retirement savings of my hardworking employees. She gave Catherine a perfunctory hug and immediately began criticizing the temperature of the house, complaining that the air conditioning was too strong for her delicate constitution. We moved to the dining room. Catherine served the roast, accompanied by roasted vegetables and fresh herbs. It was a beautiful, warm, comforting dinner. Beatrice looked at her plate, the disdain in her eyes barely veiled. She picked up a silver fork and poked at a piece of meat, as if inspecting a biological specimen. "This is certainly very rustic, Catherine," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "It reminds me of the simple meals my grandmother made during the rationing era. So quaint. You must give your recipe to my private chef. He's always looking for ways to make heavy, filling dishes for the landscaping crew." Catherine's face flushed a deep, mottled red, a mix of humiliation and hurt. She looked down at her plate, the joy completely extinguished from her eyes. Monica let out a soft, melodic laugh, reaching over to pat Catherine's hand. "Don't mind her, Catherine. She's just grown accustomed to a very specific standard of culinary artistry lately. Her new diet requires strict adherence to organic, imported ingredients." I sat at the head of the table, cutting my meat with slow, deliberate precision. I forced a warm, oblivious smile onto my face. I looked at Beatrice and nodded enthusiastically, completely ignoring the vicious insult she had just hurled at my wife. "Well, we're just simple people, Beatrice," I said, intentionally sounding cheerful and naive. "We stick to the classics. I'm just happy we can all be together and enjoy this evening like a family. It's truly wonderful to see you all so relaxed and happy." David beamed, taking a long drink of wine. He leaned back in his chair, completely at ease. He looked at me with a patronizing smirk, thoroughly enjoying his perceived superiority. "It's a great evening, Dad," David said smoothly. "Everything is running perfectly. You really don't have anything to worry about. Just sit back and leave the heavy lifting to me." At that exact moment, the burner phone deep in my left pocket gave a sharp vibration. I maintained a stiff smile. I nonchalantly slid my left hand under the heavy mahogany dining table and slipped the small device out of my pocket. My eyes remained locked on David, nodding along to a boring story he'd started telling about his golf handicap. Under the table, I pressed my thumb to the screen to unlock it. The brightness was set to the lowest setting, casting only a faint, dim glow against my palm. It was a text from Thomas Bradley. The forensic excavation had started striking gold. The first message was brief and objective. Kensington Holdings is a shell company registered in Delaware. Zero business operations. Sole purpose is as a conduit entity for receiving wire transfers. I took a bite of food, chewing slowly. Beatrice had started complaining about the quality of the wine David brought. I glanced down again. A second message appeared on the screen. I've cracked the ledgers for Bidge Consulting. You were right, total fraud. No employees, no services rendered. The $30,000 monthly consulting fee, paid by Caldwell Logistics, is automatically routed through a payment processor to an account held at Royal Bank of Grand Cayman. I looked at Beatrice across the table. She was dabbing the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin, complaining that our dining room lighting was unflattering. This woman, who was criticizing the aesthetics of my home, was a financial parasite draining my life's work. My phone vibrated again, the third message. I intercepted the outbound routing numbers for the Cayman account. The money doesn't stay there. Within 24 hours of receiving Caldwell funds, wire transfers are executed and sent to 3 separate entities: Sun Crown Casino Group, Horizon Island Gaming Center, and a private debt restructuring firm operating out of Macau. She's moving the money faster than she's stealing it. The debt is astronomical. She is using the house as leverage to pay margin calls. I felt a cold, hard knot tie itself in my stomach. The scale of the scam was suffocating. David sat right in front of me, laughing at a joke Monica had just made, completely unaware that his entire criminal enterprise was being dismantled piece by piece beneath my dinner plate. He was so arrogant, so blindly confident in his own intelligence, that he had never once stopped to consider the possibility that I was hunting him. I watched Catherine offer Beatrice another portion of vegetables. Beatrice waved a hand at them dramatically, refusing, claiming she'd had enough simple carbohydrates for one evening. I wanted to scream, but I remained perfectly still. I had to let Thomas finish his work. My phone gave one final vibration. It was a longer, continuous pulse. As I lowered my gaze, my face remained perfectly calm. Thomas's text was stark and absolute. "Richard, get outside. You need to hear this. They aren't just stealing company cash flow." The words on the screen sent a surge of adrenaline slamming into my chest. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took a deep, steadying breath. I looked up at the table. David was swirling his wine glass, completely content with his stolen life. Monica was smiling at him. They were the perfect portrait of ignorant, arrogant bliss. I cleared my throat softly, drawing their attention. "Excuse me, I'll be back in a moment," I said, keeping my voice gentle. "I think the roast was a bit too heavy. I'd like to go outside and catch some fresh night air." Catherine looked at me with concern. I gave her a reassuring smile and pushed back my chair. I walked through the kitchen and slipped out through the glass doors. The cool night air hit me, but it did nothing to settle the fury burning inside me. I cut across the lawn, slipped out the back gate, and headed toward a quiet, dimly lit parking lot behind our community center. Thomas Bradley was waiting in the exact spot I knew he'd be. His black sedan was parked in the deepest shadow under a cluster of oak trees. I opened the passenger door and slid into the leather seat. The interior was bathed in the pale blue glow of a laptop screen. Thomas didn't offer a greeting. He dealt only in cold, hard facts. "You need to brace yourself, Richard," Thomas said, his voice flat. "I spent the last 3 hours digging deep into your son's digital footprint. He isn't just embezzling cash. He's orchestrated a financial catastrophe and is steering the entire ship straight into a concrete wall." I stared at the glowing screen. "Tell me exactly what you found. I already know Beatrice is gambling away company cash flow through those fake consulting fees." Thomas shook his head. "The casinos cut off her credit 6 months ago." Beatrice turned to alternative funding sources. She owes an international loan shark syndicate over $2 million. They are demanding weekly tributes, and the interest is compounding at an astronomical rate. She is drowning, and she has dragged your son into the deep end with her." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "So David is draining the operational accounts to keep her afloat," I stated. "It's worse than the operational accounts," Thomas replied. $30,000 a month isn't nearly enough to cover the weekly interest Beatrice owes those syndicates. David needed a massive, untraceable pool of liquidity. He crossed the ultimate line. He is actively draining the Caldwell Logistics Employee Pension Fund. "The pension fund," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "He's stealing the retirement savings of my workers, the men and women who gave their lives to my company. He's already pulled over $4 million from the principal reserves," Thomas confirmed, pulling up a complex series of ledger transfers. "He's routing it through Beatrice's shell companies and wiring it directly to Macau. He's burning your employees' future to pay off his mother-in-law's gambling debts." My son was a monster. But Thomas wasn't finished. "There's a reason he dared to take such an insane risk," Thomas continued. "David is a coward. He knew that tapping into a federal pension fund would bring the authorities down on him. He needed an absolute guarantee that when the house of cards collapsed, he'd walk away clean. He needed a designated scapegoat. He set me up," I said quietly, the reality sinking in. "He set you up perfectly," Thomas said, tossing a thick stack of printed documents onto my lap. "I found these in a hidden partition on the main server. David used your digital signature to forge legally binding declarations. He drafted documents naming you as the sole guarantor of Beatrice's massive loan shark debts. He forged executive orders authorizing the creation of those ghost subsidiaries that drained the pension fund. Every wire transfer, every illegal loan, every cent of stolen money has your name attached at the top of the chain of command." I looked down at the documents in my lap. The forged signatures looked absolutely authentic. The legal language was bulletproof. If a federal investigation is launched, or if the loan sharks decide to use violence to recoup their principal balance, all of the paper trails will lead directly to your home office, Thomas explained. David built this massive criminal enterprise to make himself look like an innocent subordinate, just following the crazed orders of his aging father. If this operation goes south, Richard, it is you who will go to federal prison. You will die in a cell, and David will take over what's left of the assets. This terrifying reality made my jaw clench tight. My own flesh and blood had systematically orchestrated my financial ruin and physical incarceration. I had spent 40 years building a legacy of honor, and David had twisted it into a noose to place around my neck. I looked toward my home, where my son was currently drinking my wine and smiling at my wife. "How long until the annual corporate audit?" I asked, my voice becoming a cold, mechanical friction. "External auditors are in 3 weeks. When they look at the pension reserves, they'll see the massive deficit. The whole conspiracy will blow wide open." Thomas let out a heavy breath. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out one final document, encased in a clear plastic sleeve. He handed it to me. The ambient light from the laptop illuminated the bold text at the top of the page. "David knows about the upcoming audit," Thomas said calmly. "He knows the external regulators won't be able to miss the deficit. He doesn't intend to let you take the fall after the audit happens. He intends to close the trap before the auditors even set foot in the building." I took the plastic sleeve from his hand. I read the title of the document. The blood in my veins turned to ice. "This is a drafted, legally binding application for emergency medical guardianship, Thomas explained, his tone laced with genuine disgust. I intercepted emails between David, Monica, and a private judge who has absolutely no ethical compass. They plan to submit this application in a closed-door session next week. They will testify under oath that your behavior has become erratic and dangerous. They'll claim you suffer from severe dementia and are actively destroying the company with reckless financial decisions. I stared at the application. It outlined a blueprint for completely stripping me of my personal rights and medical autonomy. It painted me as a broken man, incapable of caring for himself. Once the judge signs that order, you immediately lose all legal authority, Thomas said. David and Monica will be granted total control over your life and Caldwell logistics. They'll lock you in a secure memory care facility, isolating you from the world. You won't be able to speak to Catherine, your lawyers, or the authorities. Once you're silenced, David will use his power as guardian to cover his tracks, blame the missing pension funds on your supposed cognitive decline, and walk away with everything. They were going to bury me alive. I sat in the dark passenger seat of Thomas Bradley's car, staring at the drafted guardianship application. They were going to bury me alive. The scale of their cruelty washed over me, replacing the last remaining fragments of paternal love in my heart with a cold, absolute resolve. I handed the plastic sleeve back to Thomas. I didn't shed a single tear. I looked at the forensic auditor and nodded. The moment for grief had passed. Now it was time for war. I told Thomas to start securing the evidence immediately, instructing him to track every cent of stolen money and build an impenetrable fortress around my personal assets. I stepped out of his car and walked back toward the house across the damp grass. The next morning, I began the most important performance of my life. If David and Monica needed me to be a senile, addled old man to validate their fraudulent court application, I would give them a masterpiece. I walked into the kitchen where Catherine was pouring coffee, and David was standing by the island reviewing reports on his tablet. I deliberately dragged my feet, letting my body hunch over heavily. I looked straight at my son, letting a blank, empty expression crawl across my face. "Good morning, Michael," I said, using the name of my late brother. "Have you finished the inventory logs for the warehouse?" David froze, slowly lowering the tablet. He exchanged a wide-eyed glance with Catherine. "Dad," David said, his voice dripping with faux concern. "It's me, David. Michael has been gone for 20 years. Do you feel all right?" I blinked repeatedly, pressing a trembling hand to my forehead. I mumbled a weak apology, claiming I hadn't slept well and felt a bit disoriented. Later that afternoon, when Monica stopped by to drop off fabric samples for Catherine, I executed the next phase of my performance. I opened the refrigerator to get a bottle of water and silently placed my heavy ring of keys directly on the middle shelf, right next to the milk. I walked into the living room and began frantically searching my pockets, complaining loudly that I had lost my keys again. Monica sprang into action, adopting a patronizing nurse's tone. Within 3 minutes, she opened the fridge and let out a perfectly staged, shocked gasp. She retrieved the keys and held them up for David to see. I observed them from the corner of my eye. They were ecstatic. I could see the barely concealed glee in Monica's eyes. I watched David discreetly pull out his smartphone and furiously type a note, documenting my staged, cognitive decline for their impending court filings. They were working hard to build their case, completely unaware that they were merely dancing on the stage I had built for them. While I played the part of a crumbling patriarch during the day, my nights were occupied by ruthless countermoves. Past midnight, I met with Thomas Bradley and my senior legal counsel at a secure location. We moved with breathtaking speed. Because the company was still entirely under my legal name, and the forged collateral documents David had created hadn't been activated by the offshore loan sharks yet. I had a narrow window to sever the gangrenous limbs of my empire. I quietly liquidated my massive personal stock portfolio, transferring the funds into a secure blind trust, completely isolating it from Caldwell logistics and David's clutches. Next, we went to work on the forged legal declarations. My lawyers worked directly with federal fraud investigators to place an immediate freeze on the collateral documents David had fabricated. We built a firewall that completely isolated my personal identity from Beatrice's $2 million offshore debt. If those syndicates came knocking for their money, they would hit an impenetrable wall. But my most devastating move was structural. 30 years ago, I had personally financed the construction of our primary distribution center. The company still held a massive mortgage lien on the property. Operating in the shadows, I executed a complex legal transfer, stripping that massive lien from the corporate holding company and moving it directly into my own private trust. With the stroke of a pen, I went from a vulnerable founder to the most powerful, untouchable creditor of my own company. If David successfully seized the company through his fraudulent guardianship, he would inherit a mountain of debt that had to be repaid directly to me. By the weekend, the trap was perfectly set. I had successfully preserved my personal wealth, completely neutralized his malicious leverage, and possessed enough forensic evidence to send him to federal prison for a decade. But I needed one final, incontrovertible piece of physical evidence. I needed to catch him in the act of blatant theft to destroy any defense he might attempt in court. I needed to capture his true intent. Thursday night, I retreated to my home office. I sat before my heavy oak desk and pulled out a stack of formal letterhead with gold-embossed company logos. I began drafting a document intended to be the ultimate lethal bait. I titled it, "Immediate Transfer of CEO Power." I filled the page with dense, highly realistic legal jargon outlining a decision to fully transition my position at Caldwell Logistics to David. I included clauses transferring total control of all assets and unrestricted banking authorization. It was exactly what he and Monica were trying to achieve through fraudulent court filings, just packaged as a voluntary gift. I printed the document and placed it precisely in the center of my leather desk mat. I laid my favorite gold fountain pen right next to it, leaving a glaring, empty signature line. I ensured the document looked like a work in progress, something I was considering but hadn't finalized. It was a lethally dangerous piece of paper. To a desperate man, an unsigned transfer of power is an invitation to complete forgery. I stood up and walked to the tall bookcase against the wall at the far end of the office. Deep within the hollowed-out spine of an antique encyclopedia, I had covertly installed a motion-activated micro-camera. The lens was smaller than a pinhead, and the angle was perfect, capturing the entire surface of my desk. I synced the live feed directly to my encrypted burner phone. I adjusted the lighting in the room, casting a soft, dramatic glow over the desk, ensuring the document was the visual focal point of the entire space. I walked out of the office, intentionally leaving the heavy wooden door slightly ajar. I walked into the main kitchen, where David was helping Catherine clean up dinner. I let out a loud yawn, announced that my brain felt particularly foggy, and that I was going upstairs for a long, deep sleep. I told them I had left important documents on my desk and requested that they not disturb my office. I walked up the stairs, my heart beating in a steady rhythm. I closed my bedroom door and pulled out the burner phone. The screen flickered to life, showing my empty office and the blank signature line waiting in the dark. I stared at the glowing screen, watching the shadows lengthen across my mahogany desk. The house was quiet, but the air felt unnaturally heavy, the weight of my son's betrayal suffocating me. I turned to the bedside, where Catherine was lying awake, her eyes searching my face in the dim light. I went over and gently took her hand. I told her to quietly pack an overnight bag. I explained that we couldn't stay in this house tonight. David and Monica were still downstairs in the kitchen finishing the remaining wine, pretending to be the perfect, loving family. I couldn't sleep under the same roof as the people who were plotting to lock me away. We slipped out through the private side door connected to the master suite, leaving our home like fugitives in the night. A black sedan, arranged earlier by Thomas Bradley, was waiting at the corner. It whisked us directly to a secure private suite at a downtown hotel, far away from the toxic deception that filled our own living room. The hotel room was sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of the home we had just abandoned. I connected my laptop to the secure network Thomas had established, streaming the live video feed from the burner phone to the larger, high-definition monitor. Catherine sat on the edge of the rigid mattress beside me, wrapping a thick wool shawl around her shoulders. We sat together in the sterile darkness of the hotel suite, eyes glued to the digital window, looking directly into the sanctum of my enterprise. For over an hour, the screen showed nothing but the silence of my empty office. The gold fountain pen shimmered faintly under the ambient streetlights shining through the large window. The trap was laid perfectly, completely untouched. Catherine rested her head on my shoulder, her breathing shallow and ragged. She wanted to believe David wouldn't cross that final line. She desperately wanted to believe that the boy she had carried for 9 months, nurtured and loved unconditionally, would walk straight past the office door and go to sleep. But I knew the intoxicating pull of desperation. David was drowning in his mother-in-law's massive mob debts, and the document resting on the desk was his ultimate salvation. At 1:15 a.m., the heavy wooden door to my office pushed open with a slow creak. Catherine let out a soft gasp, her fingers digging painfully into my forearm. 2 dark silhouettes stepped into the room. David reached out and turned on the small brass reading lamp perched on the edge of the bookshelf. The dim, warm light illuminated his face, revealing a mask of absolute predatory focus. Monica followed closely behind him, her movements quick and silent. They didn't look like a couple checking on an elderly father at all. Their movements carried a synchronized, calculated precision, like thieves breaking into a vault. David immediately circled the filing cabinet, heading straight for my desk. His gaze locked onto the single sheet of paper with the gold-embossed letterhead lying in the center of the leather desk mat. He leaned over, placing both hands flat on the desk, his eyes scanning the dense legal text I had painstakingly drafted hours earlier. I watched his chest rise and fall rapidly as he absorbed the weight of the document. He picked it up, holding the paper close to the brass lamp, reading the specific terms outlining my immediate, voluntary transfer of CEO power and unrestricted banking authorization. A slow, sickening smile spread across his face, warping his features into something unrecognizable. He turned to Monica, holding up the document like a winning trophy. "Look at this," David whispered, his voice a mix of disbelief and pure exhilaration, trembling slightly. "He actually drafted it. The old fool is practically handing over the keys to the entire kingdom on a silver platter. He's so terrified by his own fear of cognitive decline that he's voluntarily drafted exactly the letter of surrender we needed." Monica stepped closer, snatching the paper from his hands. She read the terms quickly, her eyes darting across the page. Her lips parted, revealing a massive, malicious grin. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed through the quiet office, devoid of any human empathy. "I can't believe this is actually happening," Monica sneered, flicking her wrist with extreme arrogance and tossing the document back onto the desk. "He made it impossibly easy. I actually thought we were going to be fighting him in court for months. But look at him, David. He's completely broken. He really is just a decrepit old cash cow, waiting to be milked dry. The pure vitriol in her voice was physically sickening. Catherine began to sob silently beside me, tears streaming down her cheeks as she heard the woman she had personally welcomed into our home mocking my existence. But the horror was far from over. David picked up the gold fountain pen, spinning it smoothly between his fingers. He stared down at the empty signature line, waiting at the bottom of the page. "We don't even need to forge it now," David said, his tone chillingly cold, having completely abandoned all moral boundaries. "We'll let him think it's his own brilliant idea. During Friday night's family dinner, I'll bring it up casually. I'll play the concerned son, telling him how tired he looks and how much he needs to step down for the sake of his own health. We'll place this same document in front of him, and to save face, he'll sign it willingly." He laid the pen back on the desk, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the paper. "Once he signs it on Friday, our problems are completely solved," David continued, his voice dropping to a low, threatening register that made my skin crawl. "We stabilize the remaining pension funds. We appease the mob, and we quietly finalize the emergency medical guardianship papers on Monday morning. By the end of the month, we'll have him committed to that specialized psychiatric facility in Nevada. It's remote, highly secure, and strictly controls all outside communication. He'll never be able to speak a single word to any lawyer or bank manager again. Beatrice will be absolutely safe. Our debts will be wiped clean, and we'll finally have the total control we deserve." Catherine broke down, emitting heavy, uncontrollable sobs. Hearing the cruel calculation of her own son planning our permanent imprisonment shattered her heart. She buried her face in my shoulder, shaking violently as the reality of their greed washed over her. I offered no words of comfort. I simply wrapped my arm around her shaking frame, holding her hand tightly. My gaze remained locked on the glowing monitor, watching these two pathetic rats scurrying happily through the maze I had meticulously designed for them. The paternal love that had once blinded me to their nature evaporated completely, replaced by a dark, icy resolve. "Let them eat their Friday night dinner," I whispered. "It will be their last." Friday evening arrived with a stifling, oppressive humidity, much like the tension pressing deep into my chest. As the sun began to drop below the tree line, Catherine and I drove up the winding driveway of the Kensington estate. Private valets stood on either side of the wrought iron gates, and the circular courtyard was packed with high-end luxury cars. Beatrice hadn't just planned an intimate family dinner to execute their coup. She had invited an audience. She had assembled a collection of wealthy, superficial acquaintances from her circle to witness her grand new life, entirely financed by my stolen pension reserves. I pulled my car to a stop near the edge of the fountain and took a brief moment to reach across the center console and hold Catherine's hand. Her fingers were trembling slightly, but her eyes were filled with a calm, steady strength. We had spent the last 48 hours mourning the son we thought we knew. Tonight, we were simply walking into a predator's cage, fully prepared to lock the door behind us. We stepped up the stone stairs and were led inside by a hired butler. The main living room had been completely transformed into a lavish cocktail reception. A string quartet played softly in the corner, but their music was drowned out by the shrill, performative laughter of Beatrice, who was holding court in the center of the room. She was draped in heavy silk, adorned with an emerald necklace, and stood with a crystal flute of champagne, regaling her guests with fabricated stories about her real estate investments. David stood slightly behind her, looking entirely out of place despite his custom-tailored suit. His face was ghostly pale, shimmering with a thin, nervous sheen of sweat. He clutched a thick, black leather folder to his chest, so tightly his knuckles were nearly white. He looked like a trapped animal waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His posture stiffened the instant he noticed Catherine and me standing in the foyer. Monica rushed over to greet us, wearing a smile that was impossibly bright yet utterly insincere, a grin that failed to mask the malicious calculation in her eyes. She leaned in to kiss Catherine's cheek, her perfume smelling sharp and suffocating. "Richard, Catherine, we are just thrilled you could make it tonight," Monica chirped, raising her voice intentionally so the nearby guests would hear. "We know how difficult it is for you to get out these days, Richard, especially with your energy being so unpredictable lately." I leaned heavily on my cane, a new prop I had purchased specifically for this performance. As I reached out to pat Monica's arm, I let my hand shake visibly, and I widened my eyes, adopting a look of absolute vacancy and confusion. "Thank you, my dear," I said hoarsely, making my voice thin and fragile. "I'm just happy I remembered the way here. My brain has been playing cruel tricks on me all week. I keep misplacing my reading glasses and forgetting my own appointments." David watched my pathetic, manufactured display of dementia and let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders visibly dropping. Seeing my trembling hand completely validated his criminal assumptions. He believed his trap was perfectly aligned. He walked over and guided me toward a velvet armchair in the corner of the room, treating me with the patronizing caution reserved for a fragile antique. He placed the black leather folder on the side table next to me, his fingers lingering on the smooth cover. I knew exactly what was inside that folder. It was the bait I had left on my desk, the forged, absolute transfer of corporate power, waiting for my blind signature. David tapped the leather nervously, his gaze flicking toward the dining room. "You just sit here and rest, Dad," David said, his tone dripping with condescending superiority. "We'll be moving into the formal dining room shortly. After the main course, I have an important family matter to discuss with you, something that will make your life a lot easier." I nodded vacantly and sank deep into the velvet cushions. I watched the evening slowly devolve into a grotesque display of arrogance. Beatrice led her wealthy friends around the estate, bragging loudly about the custom renovations and the imported Italian marble she had hand-picked. Catherine stood quietly at the edge of the room, attempting to remain invisible, but Beatrice was determined not to let her have peace. Beatrice snapped her fingers at a passing catering server, but the young man didn't hear her over the music. Frustrated, Beatrice turned her sharp gaze directly toward my wife. "Catherine, darling," Beatrice shouted, her voice piercing the room's background noise. "Since you're standing there doing nothing, be a dear and distribute these crab appetizers to the guests. The hired help tonight is just so incompetent, and you are so naturally accustomed to serving in your quaint little kitchen." The sheer disrespect was staggering. The wealthy guests paused their conversations, watching to see how my wife would respond to being openly ordered around like a common servant in front of everyone. Catherine's face flushed a deep crimson, but she maintained absolute dignity. She didn't argue. She simply picked up the silver tray and began to move silently through the guests, offering them hors d'oeuvres. Monica watched the insulting scene with a smirk, whispering something into the ear of a lady standing beside her. I gripped the armrests of the chair, forcing myself to remain in place. The rage was building, pressing against my ribs, but the timing wasn't right. I had to wait for the main event. Finally, the string quartet stopped playing, and Beatrice loudly announced that dinner was served. We all moved into the massive formal dining room, taking our seats at a long mahogany table illuminated by dripping crystal chandeliers. The table was set with heavy silver and fine china. David sat directly across from me, the black leather folder now resting ominously beside his dinner plate. He couldn't stop reaching out to touch it. As the first course was served, I continued my performance, deliberately clattering my heavy silverware against the china and spilling a few drops of water onto the pristine tablecloth. David watched my trembling hands with barely concealed glee. He was counting down the seconds until he could shove that pen into my fingers. Emboldened by her captive audience and her perceived absolute dominance, Beatrice decided to escalate her cruelty. She leaned halfway across her plate, pointing her wine glass directly at Catherine. "I must say, Catherine, I'm surprised you managed to serve an appetizer without dropping anything," Beatrice announced, her voice echoing loudly through the quiet dining room. "You really are an excellent menial servant. Perhaps once Richard is finally locked away, I'll hire you permanently." I stopped chewing. With an incredibly slow, deliberate movement, I placed my heavy silver fork onto the polished table. I stopped trembling entirely. I slowly lifted my chin and fixed a gaze of absolute, chilling clarity directly into Beatrice's arrogant eyes. The room went deathly silent. The heavy atmosphere dropped to absolute freezing in an instant. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. When you have spent 40 years building a business empire from scratch, navigating sinister board negotiations, you understand exactly how to command a room without shouting. I looked straight at Beatrice, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch until the palpable discomfort in the room became a physical weight pressing down on the guests. "My wife," I began, my voice resonating with a deep, unshakable authority that completely shattered the fragile, aging persona I had been cultivating all evening, "is the foundation of everything you see around you. She has built a life of real substance and loyalty, while you have spent a lifetime accumulating dangerous debt and hollow vanity. Never speak to her with that attitude again. You are not a reigning queen issuing decrees in a medieval palace, Beatrice. You are merely a guest at this table, and you will show the respect due to a woman who truly understands the meaning of hard work." The words hung in the air, sharp and unquestionable, slicing through the manufactured elegance of the dinner party. Catherine stood at the edge of the dining room, her posture straightened, watching me with an expression of mixed shock and profound relief. The shock on Beatrice's face was instantaneous and profound, her jaw practically unhinged. She looked around the long mahogany table at her wealthy friends, her carefully curated audience, and saw their eyes wide with excitement over the scandalous scene. The grand illusion of her supreme dominance had just been effortlessly shattered in front of them by the very man she had deemed a mindless, disposable relic. Her initial shock quickly boiled into pure, undisguised fury. Her face twisted into a grotesque mask of aristocratic rage. She stood up so quickly that her heavy mahogany dining chair tipped backward, crashing onto the imported Persian rug. "How dare you?" Beatrice shrieked, her voice stripped of all faux elegance, dropping to a sharp, jarring pitch that echoed painfully against the high ceiling. She grabbed her delicate crystal wine glass and smashed it violently onto the polished hardwood floor. The fine crystal shattered into 1,000 glittering shards, splashing expensive vintage red wine across the pristine baseboards like a pool of blood. The dark liquid seeped into the grout, leaving a permanent stain. A few guests gasped, shrinking back into their plush seats and exchanging terrified, uneasy glances. Monica let out a sharp, dramatic exclamation, rushing to her mother's side, wrapping a comforting arm around her shaking shoulders and glaring at me as if I were a common assailant. "You arrogant, ungrateful old fool," Beatrice screamed, pointing a trembling, diamond-clad finger directly at my face, her chest heaving with theatrical indignation. "You come into my beautiful home, eating my expensive food, and you dare to speak to me with such blatant, unacceptable disrespect. I will not tolerate this. I absolutely cannot tolerate being subjected to this unbelievable insult in front of my closest, most respected friends." She whipped her head around to face David, her eyes burning with demanding, irrational rage. "David, do something. Deal with this incredibly rude father of yours right now, or I swear I will have my private security team throw him into the street. He is completely out of control. He is ruining my entire beautiful evening with his insane delusions. David was already standing, his face flushing a dull, dangerous crimson. The cold panic that had been rolling beneath his surface all night was now fully exposed. His meticulously orchestrated plan was unraveling in real time, and he was terrified of losing control over the carefully constructed narrative. He needed me to remain the docile, confused victim, and my sudden display of sharp, clear defiance threatened to expose his entire criminal framework to the very people he was desperate to impress. He circled the edge of the wide table, closing the physical distance between us with heavy, aggressive strides. The thin veneer of superficial, charming charisma he usually wore had completely vanished, replaced by desperate cruelty. He stopped just inches from where I sat, towering over me in a pathetic, desperate attempt to reassert his fading dominance. He raised a hand, pointing his index finger directly at my face, his chest heaving with the effort. "What the hell is wrong with you?" David hissed, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper intended to intimidate me into immediate submission. "You are embarrassing Monica's mother in front of half the city's elite. You are having a psychotic break, Dad. You are completely confused and you are making a massive scene. You need to apologize to her right now. Do you hear me? Apologize to her this instant, or I swear to God, I'm sending you into a permanent medical facility tomorrow morning. You are clearly no longer functional in decent society and are only capable of creating disasters." He was playing his final, desperate card. He was weaponizing the impending guardianship threat, using the paralyzing fear of being institutionalized to force my total compliance. He actually believed that the mere mention of a locked facility would crush my remaining will, believing I would collapse, weep pathetic tears, and beg for his mercy to avoid being permanently locked away from my own life. The entire formal dining room went deathly silent. The hired string quartet had long since stopped playing. The professional catering staff froze in the arched doorway like marble statues, holding their polished silver trays perfectly still. The wealthy guests collectively held their breath, their eyes darting nervously between David's enraged, flushed face and my steady, chilling gaze. They were witnessing a brutal and private family execution, and no one dared to intervene or even speak a word. Catherine stood tall at the edge of the room, her chin high, radiating a quiet and invincible strength that gave me all the power I needed. David, mistaking my stillness for submission, pivoted quickly toward the side table. He snatched up the heavy black leather folder he had been carefully guarding all night. He ripped it open with unnecessary, violent force and pulled out the gold-embossed document I had drafted in my home office. It was the absolute, irrevocable transfer of my corporate power. He grabbed the gold fountain pen I had thoughtfully provided and strode back to my velvet chair. He slammed the stiff document onto the table directly in front of me, shoving the heavy paper with such force that it crinkled slightly against my chest. He pressed the cold, metal barrel of the gold pen into my hand, squeezing it tight. The silence in the room was absolute, pregnant with the heavy weight of impending destruction. The cold air conditioning hummed faintly in the background. David leaned down, bringing his face within inches of mine. His eyes were wide, filled with desperation and a terrifying, absolute greed. He spoke slowly, emphasizing every syllable with a cold, calculated threat that made my skin crawl, completely convinced he had successfully backed me into an inescapable corner. "Sign it, then apologize, now." I didn't flinch. I looked down at the gold fountain pen resting on the forged document. I slowly gripped both ends of the pen with my hands. I applied a sudden burst of force, bending the metal until the thick, gold-plated barrel snapped in two with a sharp, crisp *snap*. A pool of black ink instantly burst from the ruptured reservoir, splattering across the desk and soaking into the paper. I released my grip, letting the jagged pieces fall onto the ruined document with a sharp clatter. I stared straight into my son's horrified eyes. The silence in the dining room was heavy, filled with the stifled weight of my sudden rebellion. "You're fired," I said. The words sliced through the freezing air. David froze completely. The arrogant smirk on his face dissolved, instantly replaced by a mask of pure confusion. He blinked rapidly, stumbling backward from the table as if I had physically struck him. He opened his mouth to speak, to launch into another pathetic rant about my mental state, but I didn't give him the chance to utter a single syllable. I turned my head slowly toward the arched doorway leading to the foyer. I gave a deliberate nod. The heavy double doors swung open with a loud asterisk thud asterisk. Thomas Bradley walked silently into the dining room, his face a clinical, merciless mask. He wasn't alone. Flanking him were two broad-shouldered men in dark suits, radiating the undeniable aura of federal agents. Their badges glimmered faintly under the crystal chandeliers. The wealthy guests gasped collectively. The carefully manufactured elegance of Beatrice's lavish dinner party evaporated, instantly replaced by the chilling reality of a federal raid. David stumbled backward, his knees knocking into a chair. The color drained from his face entirely. He looked like a hollowed-out ghost. He looked at Thomas, then at the federal agents, and finally shifted his gaze back to me, his eyes wide with inescapable terror. It was the exact moment he realized that the senile old man he thought he was hunting had been hunting him all along. I placed both hands flat on the heavy oak table, bracing myself to stand straight and steady. I completely ignored the cane. I scanned the room, making direct eye contact with the wealthy, superficial acquaintances Beatrice had invited to witness her grand delusions. "My son," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the entire room, "has spent the last several months trying to convince everyone here that my mental faculties were rapidly declining. He painted a very convenient portrait, a fading patriarch losing his grip on reality. But the truth is far more sinister. David is not a concerned son. He is a cornered, desperate criminal." David raised a trembling hand, letting out a weak, pathetic squeak. "Dad, please, you don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," I commanded, silencing him instantly. "I know about the shell company registered in Delaware. I know about the fraudulent consulting fees, $30,000 a month, rooted to the Royal Bank of Grand Cayman. And I know about your desperate wire transfers to the Sun Crown Casino Group, the Horizon Island Gaming Center, and a private debt restructuring firm in Macau." Beatrice let out a sharp gasp. Her hand flew to her throat, clutching her heavy emerald necklace as if it were strangling her. The color vanished from her cheeks. The wealthy guests around her began to shift uneasily, edging away from her chair. "Beatrice doesn't own this grand new lifestyle," I continued, turning my cold gaze directly toward the trembling woman. "She owes an international loan shark syndicate over $2 million. She is drowning in compound interest and gambling debt. And to keep those violent creditors at bay, my son decided to cross an ultimate, unforgivable line." I looked back at David. He was shaking visibly with fear, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. "He didn't just embezzle cash from the operational accounts," I announced, ensuring every guest could hear the absolute depth of his depravity. "David secretly bypassed security protocols and systematically siphoned over $4 million directly from the Caldwell Logistics Employee Pension Fund. He stole the retirement savings of hardworking men and women to fund his mother-in-law's pathetic gambling addiction." A ripple of shock and disgust washed across the massive room. Monica buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The illusion of their perfect, superior life was being violently torn apart, and the witnesses were the very people they had been desperate to impress. "But David is also a total coward," I stated, my voice echoing with righteous fury. He knew that stealing a federal pension fund would inevitably bring the authorities down on him, so he needed a guarantee that he could walk away clean. He used my digital signature to forge legally binding documents naming me as the personal guarantor for Beatrice's massive mob debts. He forged executive orders authorizing the creation of ghost subsidiaries. He deliberately built a total criminal enterprise with the sole purpose of framing his own father for major federal crimes. The federal agent stepped forward into the room, casting a very heavy, suffocating shadow over David and Beatrice. When he realized the annual external audit was only 3 weeks away, I concluded, he decided to spring his final trap. He and Monica drafted an application for emergency medical guardianship. They planned to submit it in a closed-door session next week, claiming I suffered from severe dementia. They intended to lock me away in a remote psychiatric facility in Nevada, silencing me forever so they could seize total control of the company and cover their tracks. David collapsed. He crumpled onto the Persian rug, weeping loudly, burying his face in his hands. The arrogant executive was gone, replaced by a broken, terrified child facing the devastating consequences of his own massive greed. Beatrice, however, was unwilling to surrender. Her gaze darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape route. She shoved her heavy chair back and bolted for the arched doorway leading to the grand foyer. She moved with a frantic, desperate speed, her silk gown making a harsh sound against the polished floor. But she didn't get far. The 2 federal agents moved with swift tactical precision, stepping directly into her path and completely sealing off the doorway. Beatrice slammed into them, let out a sharp, frustrated cry and stumbled backward. She realized there was no escape. The trap had been slammed shut. I reached inside the inner chest pocket of my custom suit jacket. I slowly withdrew a thick, folded legal document, distinctly different from the ink-stained forgery currently ruined on the dining table. I held up the stiff, white paper, letting the ambient light hit the official notarized seal at the bottom. "Oh, and one more thing about this house," I said. I unfolded the stiff paper, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. David stared at the paper with wide, terrified eyes, his chest heaving as he struggled to digest the fact that his entire world was collapsing rapidly. Monica stopped sobbing, her gaze locked on the official seal at the bottom of the page. Even Beatrice stood perfectly still, her desperate escape attempt thwarted by the 2 federal agents firmly blocking the archway. When Catherine and I provided the $1.2 million down payment for this grand estate, I began, my voice incredibly steady, stripped of all paternal warmth. You both operated under a very convenient assumption that this was a simple, unconditional gift from a loving father to a successful son. You treated it as an early inheritance. You strutted around this mansion, bragging to your wealthy friends about your keen eye for real estate, convinced that my money was merely your birthright. I stepped forward, incredibly slow and deliberate, moving closer to where David sat crumpled on the Persian rug. But I didn't write a personal check, David. If you had bothered to read the financial disclosure statements your attorney sent during closing, you would have noticed the specific source of those funds. This capital didn't come from my personal savings. It came directly from the corporate treasury of Caldwell Logistics. Legally, structurally, and on the record, it is a secured corporate loan, tied to your continued employment with the company. David stared up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish struggling for air. He finally understood the fatal error he had made. Since you have actively embezzled millions from the employee pension reserves, I continued, raising my voice to ensure every guest heard the finality of my words, your employment with Caldwell Logistics is terminated, effective immediately. Because you are fired for gross financial misconduct, that corporate loan is in immediate, catastrophic default. I am not simply reclaiming your assets. I am executing immediate and irrevocable foreclosure proceedings on this property." I slammed the heavy legal document directly onto the polished mahogany dining table, right next to the jagged pieces of my broken gold fountain pen. "This is your formal notice of immediate eviction," I announced. "You do not own this house. The bank does not own it. Caldwell Logistics owns every brick, every piece of imported marble, and every inch of this manicured lawn. You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever personal belongings you can carry and vacate this property entirely. If you are still inside by tomorrow night, I will have my private security team forcibly drag you into the street." Monica let out an incredibly sharp, piercing scream. She whipped around to face David, her hands clenched into tight fists. The illusion of their perfect marriage, like their financial security, collapsed in an instant. "You promised me we were safe," Monica screamed, her face twisted into a mask of pure fury. "You swore to me that your father was too stupid to figure out the transfers. You told me the pension funds were untraceable. You ruined everything. You've ruined my entire life." Before David could conjure up a pathetic excuse, Monica raised her hand and slapped him across the face with tremendous force. The sound of the slap echoed through the quiet dining room like a gunshot. David recoiled, pressing a trembling hand to his stinging cheek. But Monica wasn't finished. She stood over him, venom dripping from her voice. "I'm filing for divorce the second I leave this house," she spat, without a shred of residual affection. "I'm not going to federal prison because of your incompetence. You are officially alone, David. Never speak to me again." She spun on her heel and strode toward the front door, pushing roughly past the stunned guests who quickly stepped aside to let her pass. She didn't look back. As Monica stormed out of the mansion, the two federal agents stepped forward, tightening the circle around Beatrice. The matriarch retreated against the wall, her aristocratic arrogance completely replaced by raw panic. She clutched her diamond necklace, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "You can't do this to me," Beatrice stammered, her gaze darting frantically between the agents and my uncompromising face. "I am a respected member of this community. I serve on 5 charity boards. You cannot arrest me in my own home. I have very powerful attorneys. I will sue you for this incredible insult." The lead federal agent reached into his jacket and withdrew a heavy pair of handcuffs. They collided, making a sharp, terrifying sound. "Beatrice Kensington," the agent said in a low, authoritative voice, "you are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, interstate money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud a federal pension fund. You have the right to remain silent." Beatrice let out a hysterical scream. She struggled frantically as the agent stepped forward, grabbed her arms and forced them behind her back. The cold cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. She kicked at the floor with her designer shoes, weeping loudly, begging her wealthy friends for help. But the guests just stared in horrified silence. No one stepped forward to defend a woman exposed as a desperate criminal. The agents practically dragged her out of the dining room, her shrill cries echoing down the long hallway until the front door slammed shut, cutting her off from the life she had stolen. David remained on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of his entire existence. In the span of a few minutes, he had lost his wife, his home, his career, and his freedom. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his cheeks, his eyes red-rimmed with absolute desperation. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, reaching out to grab the hem of my trousers. "Dad, please," David begged, his voice breaking into pathetic, desperate sobs. "Please make it stop. I'm your son. You can't just leave me here with nothing. You can't let them send me to federal prison. I'll do anything you want. I'll confess to everything. Just please forgive me. Please don't leave me." I looked down at this weeping, pathetic creature crawling at my feet. I felt nothing. The son I had loved and protected for 40 years was long dead, replaced a long time ago by this greedy, soulless parasite. I bent down slowly and yanked my trousers out of his trembling grip. I didn't offer him a single word of comfort. I simply turned my back on him forever. I walked toward Catherine. She stood near the archway, radiating a quiet, invincible strength. I rested my hand gently on her arm and offered her a soft, reassuring smile. Together, we walked toward the exit, our footsteps echoing loudly through the deathly silent, empty mansion. I did not look back at David. I simply stepped over the shards of glass from Beatrice's shattered wine glass, leaving the wreckage of their lives behind us, and walked out into the cool, tranquil, pitch-black night sky. The drive back to the hotel that night was draped in a deep, heavy silence. Catherine gripped my right hand tightly where it rested on the center console. Neither of us spoke a word. We didn't need to. The massive weight that had been pressing against our chests for the past week had finally been lifted. We had walked into a den of vipers and dismantled their entire treacherous ecosystem with absolute precision. But as we drove through the quiet, dark streets of the city, I knew the battle wasn't entirely over. The surgery to excise the cancer was finished, but the arduous process of cleaning the infected wound had only just begun. I had to secure the future of the innocent people caught in the crossfire of my son's massive greed. By Monday morning, the fallout was absolute and staggering. The scale of the federal raid on the Kensington estate was too large to cover up. Local newspapers, financial blogs, and morning news broadcasts seized the story with ruthless hunger. The headlines were brutal and unforgiving. They detailed the stunning downfall of a prominent local executive, exposing the network of forged documents, illegal offshore wire transfers, and the despicable theft of employee retirement funds. David's meticulously curated reputation was erased instantly and permanently. The business elite community, who had once eagerly accepted his lavish dinners and expensive gifts, immediately turned their backs on him. His name became poison overnight. Corporate partners canceled pending contracts. Former friends stopped answering his frantic phone calls. By the end of the day, the prestigious country club he belonged to had quietly revoked his membership. The justice system operated with terrifying, ruthless efficiency, offering the villains no solace. Beatrice faced her initial arraignment hearing on Tuesday afternoon. She stood before a federal judge in a drab prison jumpsuit, a sharp contrast to the heavy silks and imported emeralds she had been flaunting only days before. Her high-priced defense attorney argued passionately for her release, citing her age and her supposed status in the charity world, but federal prosecutors presented an insurmountable mountain of evidence provided by Thomas Bradley. They detailed her deep-rooted and ongoing ties to violent international syndicates and emphasized her extreme flight risk. The judge didn't hesitate for a single second. Beatrice was denied bail entirely. She was remanded to federal custody, forced to sit in a cold, concrete cell while awaiting a trial that would inevitably strip her of the rest of her life. Monica, revealing her cold, calculating nature, didn't waste a single second mourning the catastrophic implosion of her family. From the moment she walked out of the mansion on that fateful Friday night, she had initiated her exit strategy. By Wednesday morning, her aggressive legal team had served David with emergency divorce filings. She ruthlessly petitioned for sole possession of any remaining untainted assets, desperately trying to grab whatever meager financial scraps hadn't been frozen by federal investigators. She publicly denied any knowledge of her husband's criminal enterprise or her mother's staggering gambling debts. She abandoned David entirely, leaving him alone to face the devastating consequences of the crimes he had committed to secure her lavish lifestyle. Their marriage had been built on mutual greed, and when the money evaporated, their loyalty dissolved instantly. As my former family tore itself apart in the public eye, I turned all my attention to the innocent victims of this disaster. Thursday morning, I returned to the main headquarters building of Caldwell Logistics. The atmosphere inside the building was thick with palpable fear and uncertainty. The employees had seen the news reports. They knew their pension funds had been looted. They looked at me with wide, fearful eyes, wondering if their decades of hard work had truly disappeared into the pockets of offshore criminals. I called an emergency meeting in the main warehouse, gathering every worker, manager, and administrative assistant on the payroll. I stood on a wooden freight pallet, looking out over a sea of anxious faces. I didn't offer them corporate platitudes or empty promises. I spoke to them with absolute, transparent honesty. I confirmed the horrific truth that my son had systematically diverted over $4 million from their dedicated retirement reserves. A collective gasp erupted from the crowd, followed by a heavy, desperate silence. Then I told them the rest of the story. I explained that I had personally liquidated my massive private stock portfolio and transferred the company's primary mortgage lien directly into my secure personal trust. I looked directly at the men and women who had dedicated their lives to building my company. I told them their future was not tied to my son's failure. I announced that I was using my personal collateral wealth to refund every cent siphoned from the pension accounts, in full and immediately. The funds had been wired. The accounts were fully restored, and their retirement was absolutely secure. Furthermore, I pledged a personal guarantee to hedge their upcoming quarterly contributions as a deep expression of my profound apology for the stress my family had caused them. The response was overwhelming. The heavy silence was broken, replaced by a deep, tear-filled wave of relief. Men and women who had worked on the loading docks for 20 years approached me, tears streaming down their weathered faces, shaking my hand and expressing a Chinese letter emotional gratitude that humbled me to my core. I had walked into that warehouse as a man heartbroken by the ultimate betrayal of his own flesh and blood. But I walked out surrounded by the unbreakable, undying loyalty of my true family. Those who truly understood the meaning of hard work, dedication, and mutual respect. Catherine and I spent the next few weeks quietly dismantling the remnants of our old life. We didn't want to return to that empty mansion tainted by David's greed. We sold the big house and bought a modest, small bungalow in a quiet suburb of the city. It had a wraparound porch, a small garden for Catherine, and an absolute sense of peace we hadn't felt in years. We settled in, living a quiet, comfortable routine, slowly healing the deep psychological wounds inflicted by the people we had trusted most. It was a Tuesday night in late November when that fragile peace was suddenly broken. After dinner, a violent, unseasonal thunderstorm rolled into the valley. Fierce winds howled through the bare branches of the oak trees surrounding our modest property, and sheets of ice rain hammered against the window panes with aggressive force. Catherine and I had gone to bed early, exhausted by the damp chill in the air. We were wrapped warmly in thick blankets, and the rhythmic drumming of the storm lulled us towards sleep. However, at the exact moment the clock struck midnight, the loud, jarring chime of the front doorbell echoed sharply through the silent house. I sat up instantly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The digital clock glowed green, showing exactly 12:00 a.m. Catherine woke up beside me, reaching out to grip my arm. The storm raged outside with terrifying intensity. Relentless gales drove the ice rain against the siding of our small house, but the frantic, continuous ringing of the front doorbell pierced through the cacophony of the weather. No one who came to a remote house in the middle of a torrential downpour at midnight could possibly be bringing good news. I threw back the wool blanket and swung my legs over the edge of the mattress. I slid my bare feet into slippers, wrapped a flannel robe tightly around my shoulders, and cinched the belt precisely. Catherine sat up against the headboard, her eyes wide with sudden, sharp fear. I raised my hand calmly, silently signaling her to stay in the bedroom. I walked slowly down the dark hallway, the wooden floor cold beneath my feet. The doorbell rang again, longer this time, accompanied by the sound of desperate, dull fists pounding frantically against the solid oak door. I reached the small foyer and flipped the switch for the porch light. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached out and gripped the brass deadbolt. I pulled the heavy door open, bracing against the frigid wind that rushed in for a moment. Standing on my concrete porch, illuminated by the flickering yellow security light overhead, was my son. David was completely unrecognizable, a shadow of the arrogant, immaculately dressed corporate executive who had tried to ruin my life only weeks ago. He was absolutely soaked to the bone. The custom designer suit he wore was ruined, clinging to his shivering frame like a second skin caked in black mud and urban grime. He wore no protective coat, and the freezing rain dripped incessantly from his matted, disheveled hair into his sunken, bloodshot eyes. He looked as if he had aged a harsh 10 years in a single month. His face was unnervingly gaunt, his pale skin pulled tight over prominent cheekbones, bruised by the brutal reality of his new existence. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so loudly they made a rhythmic clicking sound even over the roar of the deafening storm. He had absolutely nothing. He carried no luggage, no bag, and there wasn't even a cell phone in his trembling, mud-stained hands. He was a broken, desperate creature, chewed up and spat out by the cruel reality he had so arrogantly tried to manipulate. I stood silently in the doorway, blocking the entrance with my body, my expression a mask of absolute, unreadable indifference. I did not move an inch to invite him into the comforting warmth of my hallway. I did not offer him a dry towel, nor a cup of hot coffee. I simply looked down at him, letting the cold reality of his pathetic existence settle heavily between us. David looked up at me, his wide eyes filled with an agony of intertwined terror and deep despair. He opened his mouth to speak, but at first, only broken, stifling sobs escaped his trembling lips. He collapsed heavily onto the wet concrete slab of the porch, the ice rain continuing to hammer mercilessly against his slumped, defeated shoulders. He extended his freezing, purple-tinged, trembling fingers, hovering his hand inches from the hem of my flannel robe, clearly too terrified to make actual physical contact. "Dad," David cried out, his hoarse, broken whisper barely audible over the whistling, relentless wind. "Please, Dad, you have to help me. I have absolutely nowhere else to go." I walked for miles across the city in the freezing rain. I really have nothing left. I remained perfectly still, like a silent, immovable sentinel guarding the hard-won piece of my new life. I waited patiently for him to continue, knowing with absolute certainty that the truly cowardly nature of his character would inevitably expose itself, even in his moment of absolute, bottomed-out defeat. David cried louder, wiping his wet, filthy face with the back of a trembling, grazed hand. "It wasn't my fault, Dad," he pleaded, his voice rising in a frantic pitch, desperately trying to rewrite the damned narrative that led to his own stunning destruction. "I swear on my life, it was all Monica and Beatrice. They brainwashed me completely. They manipulated my emotions." Beatrice was drowning in those massive, dangerous mob debts, and Monica threatened to leave me forever if I didn't find a way to maintain our lavish lifestyle. They backed me into a corner, Dad. They forced me to forge those financial documents. They essentially coerced me into tapping into those employee pension funds. I never meant to hurt you. I was only trying to save my failing marriage. I was terrified of losing everything I had built, and they were the ones who poured the poison against you into my mind. They made me believe you were losing your memory. They made me believe the only logical way to save the company from your declining health was guardianship. It was their vicious plan from the start. His frantic words were nothing more than a cowardly attempt to shift the weight of his undeniable criminal guilt. Even now, even as he was destroyed, kneeling in the cold mud like a stray animal, he couldn't take unconditional responsibility for his own staggering greed. He was still the same arrogant man who had planned to lock his own father away in a sterile, isolated psychiatric ward. He looked up at me again, his swollen eyes silently begging for just one more drop of the kind of paternal weakness he had ruthlessly exploited for decades. "Monica took everything from me, Dad," David continued, his voice cracking with sickening self-pity. "Her ruthless divorce lawyer froze all of my personal offshore accounts. The federal prosecutors have permanently confiscated whatever assets I had left. The prestigious friends I had won't even answer my desperate phone calls now. I've been sleeping on the dangerous streets of the city. I'm freezing, and I'm incredibly hungry. Please, Dad, I'm your only son. I'm your own flesh and blood. You can't just leave me out here to die in this freezing storm. I'm not asking to come inside the warm house. I'm not asking for a soft bedroom or a hot home-cooked meal. I just need a dry, safe place to lie down for a few hours. Please, Dad, just let me sleep in the garage. Let me curl up in a cold, concrete corner for one night just tonight, so I don't freeze to death in this horrific storm. I'll be the first one gone before dawn tomorrow. I swear to you, you won't even notice I'm there. Please, I'm begging you on my knees for a second chance." I looked down at my trembling, weeping son, the most painful, final test of my remaining resolve. I stared at the man kneeling on my wet concrete porch, looking into his bloodshot eyes. The ice rain continued to wash over him in heavy, relentless sheets, pressing his ruined, expensive hair flat against his skull. The cold wind howled around us, rattling the porch light, but the cold in my chest was far more profound. This was the boy I had once carried joyfully on my shoulders through a summer park. This was the young man I had proudly guided through his first attempts in the corporate world, giving him every possible advantage. But now, in this weeping, desperate, shivering shell, there was absolutely no trace of a son left. He was merely a predator whose dangerous fangs had been pulled, begging for shelter from the cruel storm he had deliberately, meticulously engineered himself. I leaned forward slightly, ensuring my voice would pierce through the deafening roar of the midnight storm. I did not shout. I spoke in a quiet, devastatingly certain tone, one that carried the heavy finality of a judge delivering a permanent, irrevocable sentence. "I gave you an empire," I said, my words landing like heavy stones on the wet porch. "I handed you a legacy of honor, a life of unimaginable privilege, and opened a door to everything I had built with my own two hands. In return, you tried to put me in a cage. You conspired to lock me in the darkness and erase my existence, simply so you could comfortably feed your endless, pathetic greed." David let out a loud, miserable wail, bowing his head until his forehead nearly touched my slippers. He reached out again, his fingers scraping desperately against the concrete. "Dad, please, I'm begging you," he sobbed. "You are no longer my son," I continued, cutting off his pathetic pleas with an absolute, unyielding finality. "You are merely the consequence of your own greed, and consequences must be faced alone." I stepped backward, retreating into the dry warmth of my foyer. David lunged forward, his hand slapping loudly against the wooden threshold, but I was already in motion. I gripped the heavy brass handle on the solid oak door. I took one last look at him, watching the horrific realization wash over his pale, frozen face. I slammed the heavy door shut. The thick wood clicked into the frame, instantly silencing his desperate, muffled cries. I raised my hand to twist the heavy brass deadbolt, listening to the solid, dull thud of the metal locking him out of my life forever. I stood in the quiet hallway for a long time, lost in thought, listening to the dull rhythm of the rain drumming against the glass. I realized that the man I had mourned hadn't died tonight. He had died many years ago, slowly replaced by a stranger who had been completely consumed by his own vanity and blind ambition. I finally accepted this profound truth. My breathing was slow and incredibly steady. The crushing weight that had been pressing against my shoulders for the past 48 hours had evaporated completely. I untied the belt of my flannel robe, adjusted my collar, and turned away from the door. I walked slowly into the main living room. A warm, comforting amber glow flickered from the small brick fireplace. Catherine was sitting in her favorite armchair, a thick woven blanket draped elegantly over her knees. When she saw me walk into the room, she looked up, her eyes searching my face for any trace of lingering regret, guilt, or hesitation. I simply smiled. I walked over, sat down beside her, and reached out to hold her warm hand gently. Together, we sat in the calm, golden light of the fireplace, listening to the storm rage harmlessly outside our thick walls. We were finally safe. The legacy we had built through such hardship had been fully protected from the vultures who had tried to tear it apart, and the years we had left belonged entirely to us. Blood ties connect you, but loyalty and respect make you family. As a parent, your instinct is to protect your children at all costs, to hand them the world on a silver platter. But blind generosity to an entitled heart only breeds monsters. Never allow love to blind you to disrespect, and never allow anyone, even your own flesh and blood, to treat you as collateral damage in their selfish games. Sometimes, the most profound act of self-love combined with hardcore love is having the courage to close that door and shut out those who only see your value in dollar signs. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your own peace? Share your stories in the comments section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life stories about survival, betrayal, and ultimate justice. Thank you for watching and supporting my channel today.